So the other day I posted a video interacting with Anthony Costello from this video that he had posted, I guess, a couple months back. And he was relaying and interacting with my critique of biblical genocide. And he was taking umbrage to the fact that I would call people who defend genocide apologists. Go figure. So I offered a critique of that, but the main point of this video was that they were having on this fellow David Wolcott to talk about Wolcott's criticisms of my book, Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, and more generally, my critiques of Alisa Childers and her terrible book, Another Gospel. And so I tried watching more of the video because I'll just say this at the outset. I agreed to debate Wolcott a few years ago, and found him to be just a terrible debater and frankly insufferable. I eventually blocked him. He's the example of somebody, so he lacks a formal education. He talks in this video about how he reads 40,000 pages a year or something like that. So he's presenting himself as, I guess, an autodidact. He's self-taught on issues like theology and theological method and historical theology and church history, etc. Um, but sometimes people can be autodidacts and they can, of course, be profound, deep thinkers. But there's also a real problem there, just like with any area. If you lack formal education, if you've never been subjected to the rigors and discipline of learning how to write a research paper and to do research and to have that evaluated by a professor, to be able to identify main arguments and respond to them and so on, then all your reading may just end up not really serving you well because you have a tough time understanding arguments, analyzing them, and responding to them. So the fact that you read 40,000 pages a year, or you say that you do, doesn't mean a whole lot. Um, so that's the first thing. It reminds me when I was a seminary professor, in particular, the preaching professor at the seminary would often have, well, not often, but occasionally in classes, you would get a person who had been a pastor for 20, 30 years even, but who had never got an MDiv degree. And finally, for whatever reason, they wanted to go to seminary and to get an MDiv degree. They would go to the preaching class and they would be incredulous because they would say, I've been preaching for 30 years. Why do I need to take an intro to preaching course? And yet the truth is, they had never even done a Bible intro course. They'd never done a hermeneutics course. They had never done an introduction to preaching course, let alone advanced courses in preaching to understand how to exegete a text and how to develop a hermeneutical interpretation and application of the text, and how to preach that in an accessible, winsome way, and what your philosophy of preaching is, et cetera, et cetera. How to reason persuasively with the congregation, how to motivate a congregation and engage them, how to contextualize. All of these issues they would not know. And the challenge there to try to educate a person who had been self-taught as a preacher for 30 years, those would be among the most difficult people to deal with in a seminary academic context. I get the sense from David Wolcott, you'd have those similar kinds of challenges. So I tried watching like 20 minutes of this, and he's rambling on and on about different things with respect to me and Alisa Childers and the progressivechristianity.com or .org website and who owned that website in what year. And he makes a big deal out of Brian McLaren saying that Brian Zond is a progressive Christian, so must mean Brian Zond is a progressive Christian. All this just gives me a headache. There's somebody here who cannot follow the most basic issues and arguments. I just want to play a clip from Wolcott rambling here, and then I'm just going to offer some big picture comments on Alisa Childers and the central issues with her false and harmful teaching. Okay, here we go.
If you want to say it's not, you have to present a better source.
Good. Okay.
And pointing to Brian McLaren, who's in that source, is not going to work. Pointing to people that they're not represented by it, but Brian McLaren lists them as introductions to get to his place, that's not going to work, especially if you're a 20-year seminary professor. I would expect better from. I mean, I'm a 3-time college dropout. I'm reading this stuff because I'm reading their books and taking it at face value. How am I doing better research than a 20-year seminary professor?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry to be snarky, but
No, well, look,
So that's classic case here of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Put simply for the layperson, the less you know about a topic, the more likely you are to overestimate your mastery of the topic or your familiarity with the topic. Um, so anyway, here's the main thing. The critical core issue with Alisa Childers, to go back to her book, Another Gospel, is that the central thesis of the book is that progressive Christianity, quote unquote, is another gospel than the Christian gospel, and it is another religion than Christianity. So she claims it is a completely different religion. Progressive Christianity is to Christianity as Islam is to Christianity, or as Buddhism is to Christianity, according to Alisa Childers. And this is an absurd thesis. Now, interestingly, the one person that I debated on this topic who was an academic was Doug Groteis. I debated him on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley, and he agreed to do a debate about Alisa Childers' book and her critique of progressive Christianity. But then he read the book, and in advance of the debate, he let Justin Brierley and me know that he would not be defending that thesis. So that shifted the debate somewhat because he wasn't going to argue that progressive Christianity is another religion. I mean, Doug Groteis is a smart person. He's an academic. He could certainly see that her claims were false, ridiculous, and just indefensible. David Wolcott can't see that. And so instead, he doesn't even argue and address the central thesis and respond to these very clear arguments presented against her absurd and false claims. And he talks about these all sorts of things about who the Brian McLaren endorsed Brian Zond on a website and called him a progressive Christian and all this other stuff, which is just none of that is relevant to the central issue, the central claim. So, how would one show that progressive Christianity is not another religion, as Alisa Childers claims? And that's what I'll just offer some quick thoughts on. Again, people who have watched my videos for a while, this is not going to be new to you, but I feel it's worth reiterating, especially since they produced this video and obviously put some effort into it. I'm not going to watch the whole thing. I've watched 30 minutes and didn't find much of value at all in it, and no substance in terms of critique. Her central claim again, so progressive Christianity is another religion. Well, that's clearly false. And the way you show that it's false, in the same way that if a person, well, I can just say, go out and talk to progressive Christians. I'm a progressive Christian and I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm a Nicene Christian. I'm a member of a North American Baptist church, which is a broadly evangelical church. We confess, we would confess the 1982 Niagara Statement of Doctrine, which is just a straight up Orthodox, broadly evangelical Baptistic statement. So that's me. Now, he makes a big deal about how Brian Zond is a progressive Christian. Great. Well, let's talk about that. Now, of course, Brian Zond doesn't call himself a progressive Christian. Others call him that. But what we do know about Brian Zond, I know Brian Zond not well, but I've interviewed him a couple times and then talked to him about these issues. Brian Zond has been the head pastor of Word of Life Church for 40 some years, and their two central doctrinal confessions are the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. Brian Zond is what I would call a small O Orthodox traditional Protestant Christian. So that's Brian Zond. To suggest that Brian Zond is an adherent to another religion, to suggest that I am, this is just silly. He mentions in the video, and David Wolcott mentions Peter Enns. I mean, I'm friends with Peter Enns, not good friends, but I haven't talked with him for a couple years. But I've met him, we've hung out. You know, he's given endorsements to my books and so on. He's an Anglican or an Episcopalian, and he's also a professor at Eastern University, which is a broadly evangelical slash progressive Protestant school. It's not an institution for another religion. It is the school where for years Tony Campolo and Ron Sider taught, and where now Kent Sparks teaches, and of course Peter Enns as well. It's a Protestant evangelical school. It's not an institution for another religion. And in being part of the Episcopalian Church, uh, Peter Enns is part of a Christian church. It's not another religion. Rachel Held Evans, similarly, who these people and who Alyssa Childers call a progressive Christian, she was an was broadly um, I'm not going to call her evangelical, but certainly she was a member of an Episcopalian church, and her works are thoroughly Christian. And anybody who thinks they're not and thinks she's an adherent to another religion just shows their own ignorance. It's just ridiculous to claim that I or these other people are adherents to another religion is just false. So the central claim of Alyssa Childers' book is that progressive Christianity is another religion. It just isn't. Now, Wolcott talks a lot in the clip in the first part of this video that I watched about how the website progressivechristianity.org or progressivechristianity.com. Well, what I pointed out is that there are two basic ways the term progressive Christian is used for two different communities, but they overlap. So the first community is progressive Christianity as a term has been used by people who've come out of the liberal Protestant mainline tradition, like John Shelby Spong. It's also been used of people who've come out of very conservative evangelical tradition and become more progressive in their theology, like Brian McLaren. And at some points, those two groups overlap, but there are also significant differences. Many people, like John Shelby Spong, they're closer to Friedrich Schleiermacher, whereas somebody like Rachel Held Evans would be closer, I would say, to Donald Blesch or Stan Grins. And those are very important differences. And if you're not familiar with all those theologians, it helps, right, to have some familiarity with the different theological voices. Anyway, to suggest that this diverse way that the term progressive Christian is used somehow maps onto a distinct religion is again just false and ridiculous. And the last thing I'll just say is why do these people perpetuate this absurd falsehood that progressive Christianity is another religion? Well, it goes back to their ministry model. People like Alyssa Childers, she stokes false claims about quote unquote progressive Christians as a false religion that is infiltrating conservative evangelical Christianity because that is with her ministry model. It stokes fear and paranoia among conservative evangelicals and conservative evangelical parents who are worried about their children losing their faith. So she stokes all this fear that there's this new wolf in sheep's clothing called progressive Christianity that's infiltrating the churches. And then she writes books and gives seminars and does interviews and also promotes her various ministry wares online where she's going to help equip people to battle this evil progressive Christianity enemy. It's a complete fabrication, it's baloney to suggest that this is some discrete religion of people that are coming in and like wolves in sheep's clothing, they're going to destroy your children's faith. On the contrary, what progressive Christianity has done for many people is maps out their experience of moving from milk to solid food, of moving from some of the absurdities and falsehoods of a fundamentalist faith to a living, breathing faith that's engaged in the 21st century. The last thing I'll say maybe is that in her book, one of the worst things that Childers does in that book, she has this section where she talks about progressive Christian pastor as being a wolf in sheep's clothing who only wants to kill and eat sheep steak. That's what she says, that progressive Christian pastors are wolves that want to kill and eat God's sheep. I mean, I can't think of a worse way to demonize and objectify people, to stoke fear and paranoia among conservative fundamentalist evangelicals than to promote this kind of dehumanizing, objectifying, fear based rhetoric. The irony here is that they're worried about progressive Christians coming in and sowing division and leading them away from the one true faith. And yet, these people, at a higher rate than any other population in the United States, continue to support a corrupt rapist, abuser, convicted felon, insurrectionist as president. I mean, just 2 days ago, Trump attacked Thomas, I think it's Masick or Masish, forget his pronunciation of his surname, but he's the Republican in the House of Representatives who is leading the charge to get the Epstein files released, which include references to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, because he was best friends with this pedophile for years, um, knows there's a lot of references to him in there, and he's trying to keep it covered up. He doesn't want accountability for all the victims of that evil rapist. In fact, Donald Trump is calling the women that were raped by Epstein a hoax. This, in terms of its evil, reminds me of, hold on a second, I just gotta, blanking on this guy's name. Okay, I just looked it up. Alex Jones. I can't believe I forgot that. So Alex Jones of Truth Wars um, infamously attacked the bereaved parents of the Sandy Hook shooting massacre by claiming they were crisis actors, that their children did not really die. It was all fabricated. And he lost in court and was told by a court to pay like $1 billion or something in damages. The evil is hard to imagine. Imagine attacking parents who had their children killed and claiming those parents are just pretending. That is what Donald Trump is doing to women who are saying they were raped by Epstein. He's saying, oh, this is all a Democrat hoax, which implies that these women were never sexually assaulted at all. That is how evil that man is. And to come back to Thomas Masick, so that he was married for like 30 years. His wife died, I believe, of cancer a year and a half ago. He just remarried. And so Trump was attacking him on Saturday and mocking him for getting remarried. That's how evil Trump is. And so here you have these evangelicals who are worried about progressive Christians infiltrating the church with their false teaching. And they've sold out all of their moral integrity to support one of the most heinous evil men in public life in Donald Trump. I can't imagine a more egregious way to illustrate your own moral hypocrisy. You want to accuse progressive Christians, quote unquote, of undermining the faith. You have undermined your own faith and witness.